Thank you, Adrian, and thanks all for coming in after the morning break to listen. I realise coffee is a valuable commodity at this stage in the process, so I hope you've had yours. Now, I'll give a little bit of an overview of the presentation because it's not all on the NEG, so it's actually a little bit light on for some of the stuff you might be expecting, but yeah, we'll cover off on the overview. Then I'll talk about the direct impacts of the NEG. Then what I think more importantly are the indirect impacts of the NEG. Cover off on some no regrets options, and then discuss science-based targets and the bigger picture. This is our standard disclaimer here, but I'm not going to be providing any financial advice, so you can ignore that. The real disclaimer I'd like to say is this presentation is an overview of what is currently proposed, not what I think will happen. I think they're potentially very different things. There's significant disagreement between the coalition and Labor, and also within the coalition, which I'm sure you've all seen in the news. So covering off on the architecture, as I mentioned, I'm going to essentially skim over the NEG surprisingly quickly, given this is a presentation on the NEG. A couple more slides time, that'll become clear why. But the architecture, it's essentially based on a couple of requirements around reliability and emissions reduction, and retailers and large consumers that participate directly in the market, which some mining companies do, meet those obligations through having the right kind of contract structure in place. That can either be, starting on the left, you've got an example of a retailer or direct participant in the market having contracts with conventional generation and dispatchable renewables. That's all fine. In the middle, you've got an example retailer getting conventional generation, then variable renewables, and supporting that with storage also meets the requirements. The third example, you have a retailer that's just buying renewables or variable. They don't meet the reliability requirement within their portfolio, so they can then have a contract with another retailer that has a surplus of the reliability requirement, and they can meet it contractually in that sort of lateral way rather than directly with the generation assets that they're drawing upon. So that's kind of the overview. The key takeaway from that is that you contract to meet your reliability requirement, you contract to meet your sustainability or abatement requirement. Those requirements with emissions, it's specifically 26% reduction by 2030, reduction in emissions intensity of the electricity generation. That's non-EITE. Now, EITE was mentioned yesterday. Most of you are probably familiar with it, but it's emissions-intensive, trade-exposed industries. They get a free kick, so that's not included in the reduction. So it's 26% reduction in the remainder by 2030. Now, the reliability requirement is made up of a whole range of measures, which I won't go into a lot of detail right now because recently, a lot of people had been saying that that the reliability requirement was possibly taking a sledgehammer to a peanut, and that's sort of coming out as being the general consensus. The impact on the market, these settings have minimal impact, if any. The structure, though, raises questions, and I'll discuss the potential impacts on grid-tied mines in a couple of slides' time, but more broadly, the reliability requirement could favour incumbent gentailers. Gentailers are organisations that have generation and retail components. They already have quite a lot of market power, and the NEG could enhance that. This would then potentially hinder renewable energy investment and innovative solutions to the challenges the industry is facing in the transition to a low-carbon future. How effective is the NEG? Oh, I have missed this because I'm reading my notes. So anyway, I talked through that. The effectiveness is in emissions abatement. I think it's almost certain because 26% is, a lot of people say, less than business as usual. So you put the NEG in place, it's aiming for 26%. It's going to happen anyway, so tick. On the reliability front, it's almost certain to achieve reliability as well. The Energy Security Board now agrees with industry that there really wasn't a reliability issue in the first place. It was a concern that was born out of the South Australian blackouts. There are existing structures in place, and with some adjustments, they should be sufficient to manage the reliability risk anyway. The reliability component was originally more stringent, and it's already been weakened to the point that it's not really adding anything to the market anyway, and that's probably about right. Now, the other element, labour support, they have sort of indicated conditional support. Their support requires more ambition and flexibility, but that ambition and flexibility comes at the expense of certainty, which was one of the other key elements of the National Energy Guarantee. The idea was that it would provide investment certainty so people go out and build generation assets, which then provides more supply into the market, prices come down, everyone's happy. If you don't have that certainty, you have to ask yourself, what is the NEG actually achieving? If the reliability requirement's not required and it's light touch and you're not providing the certainty, then it's potentially just achieving a political solution. So effectiveness, it'll tick those boxes, but risks come along with it. Now, the impacts. So WA, we're not part of the national electricity market, even though it's called national. We're separate market, separate grid, not connected. The NEG paperwork specifically excludes WA, and the WA Energy Minister, Ben Wyatt, has said we don't want to be part of the NEG. So for WA, direct impacts, nil. Off-grid mines, you're not connected to the NEM, so impacts there are nil. Grid-connected mines, slightly different. And this is grid-connected on the East Coast in the national electricity market. There's potentially concentration of market power. That's going back to what I was discussing about the gentailers. Increased compliance costs and complexity adds to the cost passed through by retailers and the cost that mining companies who participate directly in the market will face. The reliability requirement could favour incumbent energy gentailers and hinder those innovative solutions. It's addressing what the Energy Security Board has identified as a non-existent risk. And it's got limited ambition. It has limited ambition, but it could also limit the more ambitious goals of large organisations like mining companies that have decarbonisation goals. The NEG potentially, I'll give a scenario. So if you're a large mining company and you want to decarbonise through procuring renewable energy through the network, there are provisions in the NEG that say you then need to share those decarbonisation components with other participants, and there are potentially financial penalties for not doing so. So those are the risks outlined there, and the devil's in the detail. We've heard that a few times through this conference. Indirect impacts. These are the ones that I think are the more important ones, and these are the ones that impact WA, off-grid mines, on-grid mines, anyone who's emitting CO2 in the current operations, you are potentially impacted by this. So 1/3 of national emissions come from electricity generation. Therefore, if electricity is only required to do 26% abatement, then the other 2/3 will have to come from the rest of the economy. Now, there's only 2 legislated mechanisms to achieve that abatement at the moment. You've got the Emissions Reduction Fund, which is almost out of money, and the Safeguard Mechanism. The Safeguard Mechanism is essentially, it's a carbon pricing scheme, it's a baseline and credit scheme, and it's legislated at the moment. The only way that you could achieve additional abatement under the current legislative framework without putting billions of dollars of taxpayer money into the Emissions Reduction Fund is to lower the safeguard baselines. That means any safeguard entity here, which there's a lot in the room, your baselines will go down, and if you don't achieve abatement, you will have to pay a penalty. So that's a big financial cost being shifted from the East Coast electricity market onto mining, resources, other large emitters, transport. There's a big financial risk there. And the impact is twofold, because you're being asked to do more than your fair share of the heavy lifting, and then also your cost of abatement is higher, because some of the cheapest abatement in Australia is in the electricity industry. Renewables, as we've heard from multiple presentations, they're the cheapest cost of new build energy, and they're in some cases and over time becoming the lowest marginal cost of energy, so beating an existing coal-fired power station. It's the cheapest form of abatement, and we're saying we don't want too much of that. Let's go and get the abatement from decarbonising a haul fleet. That's going to be expensive. Or you buy a lot of offsets, which will hit your bottom line. So when people talk about the NEG and they say, there's been so much debate, we just need certainty, or any policy is better than no policy, or at least it's a step in the right direction. At best, they're talking about the East Coast electricity industry, and they're not talking about the economy as a whole, and definitely not talking about the mining sector. It's steps in the wrong direction. Am I sounding too pessimistic? I was running through this yesterday. I added this slide in yesterday before giving Adrian the thumb drive, because I was reading through and I was like, oh, this is not sounding too good. So what are the options instead of pessimism? Well, eBay. I think $428 is a bit steep for optimism, but if you have to look at the NEG through the rosiest of lenses, you could say it's potentially putting in place the architecture of an emissions intensity scheme. So then you can increase the ambition over time and have a market-based signal to decarbonise. But to have this, you'd need to have the flexibility, and you'd need to have abatement ambition increases significantly and as soon as possible. So the current draft of the NEG is saying lock in that 26% to 2030. You can't change it beforehand, and that means that for over a decade you'll have those increased costs to the rest of the economy. And even then, the issues of concentration of market power and administrative burden. I forgot to press the button, sorry. The issues of concentration of market power, administrative burden, and hidden traps remain. So that was my couple of slides on optimism, and we'll go back to the pessimism. Sorry about that. So should this influence your strategic energy choices? Energy strategy is a long-term decision, so you need to think potentially beyond this. We're left with a lot of uncertainty around potential future governments increasing the energy, the emissions abatement requirement, which is good for the industry but still provides uncertainty. We need to look beyond the policies being argued in the papers. Mining companies are very comfortable making strategic investments that span many terms of government, and the approach now needs to be taken with energy too. Put another way, do you think our federal politicians are doing a good job on energy and climate policy? Do you want to be guided by the decisions they make? And a reminder of the kind of comments around climate and energy policy that we've seen recently is this comparison to throwing goats into a volcano to appease the gods. That's the level of conversation that we're seeing at that national level. And I think everyone in this room would understand that they are better at managing these strategic decisions than the debate that's being played out in Parliament. So, all of that uncertainty, what are the no regrets options? First of all, just understand your business. It's about collecting data, understanding your energy consumption, understanding your flexibility, your pathways, contracts that you're entering. If you're looking at building a new power station and you haven't included a shadow carbon price, it's over the next couple of decades, that's comparable to building a power station and not including the diesel cost or the gas cost. There's going to be a significant cost associated with the decisions you make, and it needs to be in there. Another thing that's always a good idea is efficiency. You can achieve efficiency outcomes quite quickly. They're often very short payback periods, NPV positive. It's all beneficial. Renewables, we've heard many presentations today saying renewables are an obvious option in many cases, and it's something that not necessarily an answer to everyone. Short mine life is a challenge. There are other challenges that you may have, but everyone should at least be considering it quite carefully. And you need flexibility in your energy strategy, because all of this uncertainty means things are going to change. You're going to be exposed to different cost pressures, and you need to be able to react to that. And lastly, decarbonisation planning. So we've discussed that the abatement ambition in the NEG is insufficient to achieve an optimal outcome, but what kind of abatement strategy should individual companies develop? We've heard Kirsten talk about BHP's net neutral goal in the second half of the century. South32 have a public target for net neutral scope 1s by 2050. Rio Tinto has comments in their annual report about decarbonising in the second half of the century as well. A lot of companies are starting to do this, and those progressive companies are de-risking their exposure. One way of doing it is using science-based targets. So I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not going to try and do the laser bit, but you can see the blue line at the bottom is the 2-degree scenario. That's where we need to get if we're going to decarbonise in the second half of the century and hit that Paris target of 2 degrees. The black line there is the NDCs. They're the pledges that countries made under the Paris Agreement. They're going to be tightened over time, but you can see if you wait for governments to set the goals, you're going to be on the wrong trajectory, which means accelerated action down the track. Trying to play catch up down the tail end is always going to be more expensive. So science-based targets are about getting you on the right trajectory early so you can plan your strategy accordingly. Implementing science-based targets is, there's a process to it. You need to submit it and have it approved and announce it. But there's, if you go to sciencebasedtargets.org, you can read all about it. I won't go into the details here. Beyond science-based targets, there's the bigger picture. So quite rightly, I guess, everyone's been focusing on their company's emissions, Scope 1 and Scope 2. So Scope 1 emissions are emissions that occur at your facilities, out of your equipment. It's tailpipe emissions. Scope 2 is everything that's associated with the electricity you buy. You buy more renewables, your Scope 2s go down, but it's Scope 1 and 2 are what the NEG Act in Australia requires you to report on. Scope 3 is all of the other stuff associated with the products you buy, the products you sell, the inputs to your business, and how your products are treated, manufactured, consumed down the tail end. So they're things that you've got sort of indirect influence over, but those risks are still there present to your business. So one example of that is commodity demand. In a 2-degree world, what demand will there be for your commodities? Is it going to be increased demand, or is it going to be decreased demand, or does it just stay the same? If you're producing thermal coal, there's a big risk about demand for that commodity in a decarbonised world. It's not required. If you're producing very sustainable alumina through hydroelectricity, that's a fairly resilient commodity that will still have a strong demand in a 2-degree world. Supply chain management is another element. So big companies like Tesla, Apple, a lot of automotive companies are saying, we need our supply chain to be sustainable, not just our organisation. So Tesla came to Perth a couple of years ago and started talking to lithium miners, and they're saying, what's your strategy to get to 100% renewables? We want our supply chain to be 100% renewables. So if you want to be a supplier of choice and an investment of choice, then you need to decarbonise throughout your supply chain. And that's reinforced by BlackRock, biggest fund manager in the world, $6.3 billion under management. And they're saying climate risk is underreported, understood, and underpriced. So they're going to all of their big companies that they invest in and saying, we need you to understand your climate risk and report publicly. Last slide, 1 minute left. What does all this mean? So set long-term science-based abatement targets to understand what trajectory you need to be in a decarbonised world. This is potentially another couple of levels sort of beyond the next step that some companies in the room might be wanting to make. Introducing a shadow carbon price is a good start, but what do you want your shadow carbon price to be? That'll be informed by your abatement targets. Implement renewables and plan for their share to increase. So under current technologies, a lot of sites may say, we want to max out renewables during the day, but batteries aren't cheap enough, so you're only going to get 25% reduction in your diesel. Plan for that to change. Have contracts, have flexibility, have process design that allows higher penetration of renewables down the track. Another one that's been mentioned a few times, just electrify wherever possible. If you can get onto electricity, it's going to be cheaper and it's going to allow you to decarbonise more quickly and more cost effectively. Start thinking beyond energy. That's your inputs, your outputs, all of your scope 3s and the abatement associated with your activities. You need to think beyond just the energy and think about that biggest picture. And getting back to the NEG to finish, cross your fingers that we dodge the bullet. And the bullet is that the NEG does get legislated and it's got a low abatement target and it's locked in until 2030, because that means that the NEM gets a massive free kick on abatement abatement requirement, and all of that heavy lifting will be transferred to safeguard industries, and that's where mining sector sits. Thank you very much. Feel free to bail me up and ask some questions or have a go at me afterwards. I look forward to it.